listening to the Decarbonisation Dialogue, a podcast from Salix.
Welcome to Delivering on Climate Change, our collective challenge. Welcome to the Decarbonisation Dialogue. I am Hannah Walker, and I believe that the best way to communicate a message is by being passionate about what you are talking about. Welcome to Pip Wheaton, speaking all the way from New Zealand. Pip is a social entrepreneur who describes herself as a perpetual questioner and aspiring systems changer. Pip works on climate change both locally in Wellington, in New Zealand, and globally. Her work is to support climate change makers in their ventures and research and write about what makes effective climate strategy. Her work is informed by systems theory and a fierce sense of justice. Pip began her career in Sydney's music industry and has since worked in social entrepreneurship, local government, academia and philanthropy across Australia, South Africa and the UK, among other regions. She began freelancing in 2024. So big welcome to Pip today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to get to talk.
Super, thank you. So let's start right at the beginning, because I mentioned that you started your career in the music industry, but what first inspired you to become a climate change advocate as well as social entrepreneur? Well, how does that journey begin?
If I were to trace back the roots of how I found myself concerned about and then working in climate change, it really goes back to the very early days. So I grew up in a very rural part of Australia, a tiny little town that almost nobody's ever heard of. And I grew up on a farm. And so the seasons determined the shape of our year and the weather determined the shape of our days. There was koalas and echidnas and all sorts of wildlife in our very yard. And so I grew up sort of really feeling this sense of connection with the seasons and with nature, the more than human natural world. And so when I first heard about this concept of climate change, I was probably primed to sort of have a visceral reaction to the level of precarity that was going to bring, because I'd seen that, we can't control the seasons and yet they determine whether or not we're able to grow a crop in our farm. And I sort of then blew that up into the global scale and got pretty worried pretty quickly. But when I left university, so I studied climate change at university for a little bit, I tried to find a job in climate change beyond some of the sort of the voluntary types of ways of getting involved, like getting arrested at a Greenpeace protest and dressing up as a quokka for the Wilderness Society. For anybody who doesn't know what a quokka is, it's one of Australia's most underrated, incredibly cute marsupials. There weren't really any jobs in climate change. I applied for a bunch of things and kept being turned down. And so I kind of thought to myself, oh, well, maybe the experts have got it. Maybe I don't need to be worried about this thing. And so I went on a long detour of doing a whole bunch of other things. And it wasn't until my first child was born, and I kind of found myself looking at it more head on again. And I went, oh, this is still urgent 20 odd years later. Maybe the experts need some help. How do people who aren't experts get involved? And that kind of became the thing that I got really curious about, is like, well, how do we actually bring everybody in to contribute to this global generation-defining challenge of our times?
It's really interesting, actually, that you talk about that kind of innate love of and passion and understanding of that landscape. And I think that is important. And if you're kind of lucky enough, I suppose it's a real privilege, isn't it, to have that access and understanding of that climate. I was speaking to my colleague yesterday about oceans and acidification, and where I've partly grown up, which is on the main coastline. There's been a huge change in what's happening to the shores there and the oceans, and just the way people are fishing it is a huge change, and that is, and you grow and you become more passionate about it as you learn more. I suppose you take it for granted when you're younger that this is all happening, and we've got this on our doorstep, and then you do realise as you learn more, it's definitely worth protecting, which has led you to what you're doing today. So we've got the understanding of the landscape, and how do you, though, approach in your work today? Because you call yourself a perpetual questioner and aspiring systems changer. So how does that mindset of yours now shape your approach to working with the organisations you work with? Because you work across many businesses, and you have worked across many businesses as well as local governments. But how does that perpetual question, does that not get you into trouble? Are you asking questions that people don't want to answer?
Oh, I'm sure I am. I'm sure it's very annoying. I think one of the ways it shows up is that I'm really curious. And so if there's something that feels stuck or sticky, I'm just really curious about why and what are the things that maybe are below the surface of a situation or of a problem that's showing up. And it also means that when I find myself in conversation with people who have vastly different perspectives on the world to me, rather than it gives me a way to kind of bypass what could otherwise be for me like a difficult conversation. So instead of going into defensive mode, which is probably my default reaction if somebody says, I very much disagree with this thing that you have as central to your worldview. For example, I disagree with climate change. I don't believe that it's a thing. Rather than flipping into the defensive, it gives me a way to go, oh, I'm really curious. Why do you say that? And then it gives me a way to then try and find, okay, so what are the things that you do care about? There's a whole lot of research out there that looks into what people's values are and how much our values are actually shared. At the deepest level, our values are more often than not far more commonly held than perhaps they appear at the surface. And so if I can stay in that curious questioning mode, then I'm more likely to find those things underneath where we can find common ground. And from there can build, can find solutions, can find ways to move through stuckness.
So how do we get to those solutions? Because we've got a good understanding of the science. As you say, there's a lot of research out there. There's a lot of science. There's a relatively good understanding, public understanding of this. And we've certainly got huge technological innovations. But how do we move that forward? In your view, are we going too slowly? How do we move the pace on our action?
That was kind of one of the guiding questions that I kind of became quite obsessed with for a while. I was working for an organisation called Ashoka, which is a global network of incredible systems-changing entrepreneurs. We were trying to figure out how Ashoka could start to contribute to solutions in the climate change space by bringing together our network in new and different ways. We kind of went out and just had all of these conversations with incredible people working on climate change, some of whom had been working on climate change since before I was born. These were people who hold a lot of the wisdom in this space. And that was kind of the question that we realized we were asking. How do we make the solutions are no longer the limiting factor? The science is our understanding of the science is no longer the limiting factor. It comes down to how much agency do people feel to bring their knowledge, expertise, energy, resources, time in to contribute. At the bottom of it all, we sort of started grappling with these questions of how do you build agency? With the wonderful folks at the Skoll Centre, which is a centre for social entrepreneurship at Saïd Business School in Oxford, we pulled together this research that mapped the common tactics and strategies that we saw across all of these social entrepreneurs that we were talking to. The group that we're talking to are truly global. They were on every continent. They were working with groups as diverse as like Fortune 500 companies to small fishing communities, to very local communities, grassroots stuff, and everything in between, chicken farmers. And we saw the same strategies coming up again and again. And the way that we ended up referring to them was 3 strategies. And for each of them, we picked out a few of the tactics that made them come to life. But the 3 strategies were making it personal. So a lot of people care about climate change, but unless you can hook it into the things that they love and care about, their children or the places that they love or future generations, unless you can make it personal, both in terms of what's impacted, but also in terms of how they can contribute, it's too overwhelming. Our psychological defense mechanisms kick in. The second strategy that we saw was building support. So whether that was peer support or walking alongside somebody as a mentor or coach, it was the recognition that creating change is hard. If we do it alone, it's close to impossible. So how do you build support for people who are trying to contribute to this big, gnarly challenge? And the third one was transforming systems. So all sorts of different ways to recognize that the context can often be the thing that gets in the way. With all of the energy and motivation and support in the world, sometimes it's just really quite a practical blocker. And so we looked at what are the tactics that can unlock that, the sort of the structural piece. And I find that so often in all of the spaces that I've worked in, whether it's local government or businesses or philanthropy or nonprofit space, so much of the question that people keep coming back to is like, we know this is needed. We know that this is vaguely the right shape of solution. We just need to get people to do the thing. These strategies, I think, are deceptively simple and also incredibly useful.
Okay, deceptively simple. Which I do need to ask this question because you describe yourself as a perpetual questioner, but I think you've also been described as not a traditional social media influencer. I'm not sure what that means.
I find the act of being on social media incredibly overwhelming, as I know a lot of people find in this time of constant barrage of devastating news about the state of the world. There's so much that is kind of constantly pushed in our face, even before we start talking about climate change. I have had to push myself lately to try and work a little bit more in the space of getting ideas out into the world, though. At the moment, I'm working on building a new philanthropy vehicle here in New Zealand that's a collective giving mechanism, a pooled fund to support climate action, connecting passionate people with funds with passionate people with solutions is sort of one of the ways that we describe it. And because we want to do that in a way that invites people in to participate and to really feel like they can shape that, we've taken an approach of building in the open or learning out loud, as a wonderful woman named Cassie Robinson in the UK described it. That other people might have described it similarly, but that's who I heard that phrase from. And so to be able to actually build in the open, you have to put the ideas out there, which is incredibly vulnerability inducing. So yes, the idea of being a social media influencer is not something that I have ever thought about myself. It's a space of great discomfort, but perhaps a necessary evil.
That connection there that you've just mentioned to the philanthropy work, of course, when we talk about climate change, we can see in our news that the people who can least afford are most affected by what's happening to our climate. There's a lot else going on in our world today. We've got there's a lot of other issues that governments have got to sort out. You've alluded to a couple, but how do you then inspire people who are skeptical, do you think, about climate change issues? Because social media and digital platforms are very powerful in this area. So how do you kind of balance that raising awareness and promoting that real action? Because you obviously are interested in creating action. You founded a youth organisation, you get involved in philanthropy work, you're obviously hungry for all the research, the knowledge. But how do you try and change that sort of scepticism, if you like?
There's a brilliant group who you might have talked about in other episodes of your podcast, the Yale Climate Communications Centre, and they have brilliant segmenting. If you think about our concern and our level of engagement with climate change on something of a spectrum, where you have, the people who are alarmed and highly concerned up one end, and then the people who are, to use your words, skeptical or dismissive down the other, their recommendations are to not waste time on that group that is skeptical, because they are unlikely to change their mind and they are such a small percentage. And so it would be a disproportionate use of resources to engage with them, whereas actually there's far more benefit working with the movable middle, the group in the middle who are open to being given new information and actually taking that on board to think about how they might do things differently. And from their research across the world, that group in the middle is and up to the alarmed end is far, far greater than the small group that is dismissive or skeptical at the other end. It's like single digits of percentage that are in that skeptical group. However, there are still people who might be in that movable middle, who might take more encouragement than others. And so if we leave aside the ones who are actually the climate deniers, as it were, I think when it comes to bringing people on the journey, it might not actually involve talking about climate change at all. Again, probably coming back to those shared values. So it's coming back to the things that we all love, the things that we want to protect, and figuring out what are the pathways to protecting them, what are the pathways to caring for them, and framing it in those terms. I think one of the other barriers that comes up for people that can make them tip into outward appearing skepticism or apathy is actually the sense of overwhelm. So it's not actually coming from a place of a lack of care or concern. It's the psychological defense mechanism of essentially overwhelm, trying to protect them from feeling the levels of anxiety that come from looking at climate change front on, while also feeling like there's nothing that you can do about it. One of the really helpful messages to try and focus on is that there's actually a huge amount of stuff happening, that we are not starting from zero. You know, there's so many wins, so much has shifted as a result of huge amounts of work over years and years and years. For example, in the renewable space, that are really good success stories that show that change is possible. And I think in the work that I do and have done over years, one of the things that I've had kind of front row seats for is seeing all of these incredible solutions all around the world, these incredible, passionate, driven, smart, effective individuals really doing incredible things. I get to focus on the green shoots of new possibility a bit more than most do.
So it's focusing on that movable middle, as you call it. And if you get those people, then you bring the other people along on the journey eventually, because those small percentage of people are perhaps slower movers. But it's very interesting when you talk about the shared values, and it takes us back to the very start of our conversation when we were talking about you grew up in Australia in a town that you didn't mention the name, but you said not many people have heard of it. You might want to mention it, but you grew up in a small town in Australia and had that. You watched the seasons change, and so it's that, and you cared about the environment. So those shared values, I don't think people can argue that we care about our environment. We care about our planet. We care about the seasons. We care about what's happening to the trees. We care about having an autumn, if we're lucky enough, not everybody, an autumn, summer, spring, you know, those kind of seasonal changes that we expect to see. So perhaps it is that we're putting too much pressure on talking about net zero, that we should just be relating it more to the values and the things that we care about. Because as you say, there's a huge amount of scientific research and great amount of work being done in the renewable space. And none of this is new. Climate scientists have been working on this for years. And there's a lot of potential there as well. So it's those shared values that's really interesting. If you could provide or leave our listeners with one message, I suppose one powerful takeaway today, what would it be?
I think it would be that the contributions that we all make are what matters, that it's that's not right. What is it? That's a great, I don't know. I'm not very good at being pithy on the spot. Okay. So Bill McKibben says that whenever he's asked what's the best thing that I can do as an individual, that his response is, well, first up, stop thinking of yourself as an individual. And I find that incredibly motivating because it reminds me that I don't need to do it all. I just need to do my piece, and I need to do it as well and as joyfully as I possibly can. And so I think that would be the message I'd want to leave people.
Thank you. I think that's a very strong message. And thank you very much to Pip Wheaton today for providing such insight. There can be no doubt that climate change is the biggest challenge of our time. Today, we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions to slow global warming. Today, we must act for tomorrow, adjusting our lifestyles to current and future impacts of climate change. Today we must use our collective wisdom to deliver on our climate commitments. Today we must work for tomorrow's world. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast channels, and please do email us with any ideas and views you have to podcast@salixfinance.co.uk. Thank you again to Pip for joining us all the way from New Zealand. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to the Decarbonisation Dialogue, a podcast from Salix. For more information about our work and to find more content, please visit salixfinance.co.uk/podcasts.